you can answer this. Are they seeing down in Denver that the purchase prices are going 20% over the list price? Are they
So I've seen more than 20%. Certainly there's, certainly things are going well above list price. As far as what is the actual number, I mean, that's difficult to say what the actual number is. I can tell you that I've written offers of, $435,000 on a $400,000 listing with a $15,000 appraisal gap and waiving inspections and been beat. So, is that the norm or is it not the norm? I mean, yeah, it's probably the norm. I've seen stuff go 100,000 over. My wife reviewed a contract down in, I think it was like Parker or somewhere like that, and it went for $250,000 over on a $650,000 listing. So, I think that's a little bit of an outlier. Obviously, in some of the higher price ranges, it's more likely that you're going to have, huge overbids, right? Whereas a lot of people in the $400,000 price range, like you're not going to see people bidding 650 on a $400,000 house probably. So what's the norm? I mean, I don't know what the norm is, but I can tell you that it's well above list price, particularly in the lower price ranges. And really across all price ranges, we're seeing it. I know I was talking to an agent on the call here about a deal, and they're more than $100,000 over on a deal they've got. So is it a real thing? Yeah, people are definitely feeling the crunch right now. Very, very difficult to compete if you've got a first-time buyer or someone who just doesn't have a huge financial cushion. Doesn't mean that you can't compete, but it's difficult. And probably the toughest part is that there's a lot of listing brokers out there who they're not calling you back, right? And so even if you are diligent about trying to figure out, hey, is there a way that we can be competitive and what can we do to make our offer look a little bit more attractive? Listing brokers just aren't calling you back anyway. Super frustrating. So very, very difficult to compete in this market. So, okay. All right. So we'll just start at the very top. So obviously you guys will have your own branding on here. I do get some questions about, I don't have a branded version yet, or the contract just got updated and CTM or DocuSign hasn't released our branded forms. That's okay. It doesn't have to be branded. You can just use the version from the Real Estate Commission, and that's fine. And then it will always have this little, just disclaimer at the top, right? The pre-printed portions of the form have been approved by the Real Estate Commission. If you make any modifications, those are on you, right? And then it will have the most current, it will tell you the version of the form that you're using. This is the form that we're supposed to be using right now. And then typically there's a 3-year, basically, like the forms get reviewed once every 3 years, unless there's some kind of legislative change that forces it to be, modified before that 3-year period. And so even though these were just, updated in the middle of 2019, we're still probably going to see our forms be updated later this year due to some stuff that's happening in the legislature. So not going to talk about that today, but expect that our forms will either be updated later this year or, potentially 2022. But as of right now, this is the current version of the form. Okay. Another little disclaimer here. Again, this is on pretty much all of our forms. It has important legal consequences. If parties have questions, they can talk to, an attorney, they can talk to a CPA, whoever it is that they need to talk to, that's fine. Okay. Date, obviously the date of the contract. And then number 1 defines what the agreement is. And it's obviously the buyer's going to buy and the seller's going to sell the property. And I guess before we get too deep into this, anywhere that you see a defined term, particularly if it's not at the beginning of a sentence, right? If there's a capitalized word, that means that it's defined. So even though this is at the beginning, buyer is going to be a defined term. We're going to define here. Seller is going to be a defined term. Property is going to be a defined term. Contract will be a defined term. So anytime you are writing things into, say, additional provisions or elsewhere in the contract, if you are referring to a defined term, then you're going to want to capitalize it. And if you're not referring to that specifically defined term, then don't use that term, even if you're not going to capitalize it. It just creates confusion. So that's why you'll see some of these things that are capitalized. Again, if you're going to use them, then capitalize them and refer to that defined term. So buyer's going to buy, seller's going to sell the property described below, which is going to be down here, which we'll talk about. And they're going to do it on the terms and the conditions that we're going to set forth, or that we're going to lay out here in the contract. Okay. And that all together constitutes the contract, the legally defined contract. And so, you know, when buyers and sellers are writing these things into additional provisions, right, they'll say, you know, they'll use the word offer instead of contract, right? Well, the word offer, even though you might think you know what it means, it may not, you know, it's not the technically defined term. And so if you're going to refer to this contract, right, the buyer has a right to terminate this contract, then you should use that term contract, because that's the defined term. Okay. Section 2 is where we're going to define the parties. So obviously you're going to put the buyer's names in here. Good idea to talk to the lender first, if there's a lender involved, to figure out, hey, how do you have their name structured on the loan? You know, because then you're either going to potentially have to do an amendment or something later, just extra paperwork. So talk to the lender, see how they want the buyer's names to appear on here. Is there, you know, just one buyer? Is, you know, are there two people on the loan but only one on the contract, or vice versa, right? Good idea to just get it right up front. Okay. And then the other part of 2.1 is that we have to define how our buyers are going to take title to the property. This is if we're working with the buyers, obviously. If you have the sellers, then it's not up to you. But joint, so if you're not familiar with the types, right, joint tenants is where, you know, you've got two parties who go on the contract. You could have more. You could have, let's make it crazy, and let's say you've got 5 parties that are going to purchase the property together. If they purchase the property as joint tenants and one of those 5 parties dies, their interest in the party automatically goes to the other 4 surviving parties to the contract. Okay. Or really the surviving parties on title. So that's what joint tenants is. Tenants in common, maybe where, so a couple of examples where you might use tenants in common. I had one that it was like a father and a son who was purchasing a cabin up in Red Feather. Well, if let's say that the father were to pass away, he didn't want his portion of ownership to go directly to the son because he had a surviving spouse, right? And so he wanted his, instead of going to the son, he wanted it to go to his wife, right? And then likewise for the son did not want it to go to his father. He wanted his portion of the, you know, ownership or interest in the property to go to his wife and his children. And so they took title as tenants in common. And with tenants in common, you don't have to have, you know, 50-50 ownership. You could have, you know, 80-20, 70-30, whatever, you know, fractional portion of ownership you want to designate. And so tenants in common, that's one, you know, instance where you might see tenants in common. Another would be like, you know, let's say that, you know, person A is married and person B was married, their spouses died, and then person A and person B marries, right? Well, they may not want their ownership interest in the property to go to each other. They may say, hey, I have surviving kids from my former marriage, and so I want my portion of ownership to go to my kids, not to the surviving spouse. So, you know, there are some uses for tenants in common. It's just, it's not something that you'll normally see.
Jesse, you know, if you click off the tenants in common, that's a separate contract that they make on what percentage of that particular residential is going to go to them, or is it done through this? In other words,
it's all on this.
If it's not 50-50, where would you put the difference?
That would be in the deed. And so they're going to determine that themselves. And that's not something you put in here. Yep.
That's what I asked. Okay.
Yep. So
sorry to interrupt again, but would we recommend those joint tenants, tenants in common speaking to an attorney to have a separate agreement, almost like an LLC or something to,
Yeah.
or will, or I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad idea, right? Because I mean, the problem with tenants in common is that it has to go through probate, meaning it has to go through the courts. And so if there's something that's going to have to go through the courts, well, I certainly would want my attorney to look it over, right? Whatever it is, my will or, you know, anything else, right? I want that to be reviewed by somebody who's competent to do that. Nobody on this call, as far as I know, is really competent to do that. And so, yes, they should be talking to an attorney as far as if they're going to do tenants in common, what does that look like for them? What are the consequences of doing that? And so on. Joint tenancy does not require anything to go through probate. It's just automatic. Once that person dies, their ownership interest in the property will just automatically go to the other property. Now, there's things that need to be filed, death certificates and whatever else, but you don't need to have your clients talking to an attorney, if they're going to take title as tenants in common. But good idea to do it if they're taking title, you don't need to have them talk to an attorney if they're taking title as joint tenants, but good idea to do it as tenants in common. So,
okay, deep
Okay.
dive question here.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's good.
If they're
I'm not here to listen to myself talk for 2 hours. So if anyone else has questions, chime in too.
So my brain is dominoing. So I am familiar with the probate process, unfortunately. And so in order for them to avoid that, but at the same time, like, I feel sellers might be more hesitant to sell to a LLC as opposed to individuals. Now, maybe that's just a stigma that I've created in my head, but would you recommend that they maybe take it as tenants in common, but then do a quitclaim deed to then transfer it to their LLC or something so that probate is avoided later on down the road?
Well, are you talking about transferring it before closing or after closing?
Immediately after closing.
So if
To
it's
win the
after,
contract, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So you don't have to put their entity on there.
well, so if it's obviously if it's after closing, the contract has nothing to do with it, right? And let me hit on this piece real quick, and then let's talk about that, because what section 2.2 says, right, is that this contract is not assignable by buyer unless otherwise specified in additional provisions. So whatever buyer's name you put here, right, is effectively what you're saying is this is the buyer for the property, right? So you can do a couple different things. One is you can make the contract assignable simply by going to additional provisions and putting in there, in regards to section 2.2, buyer has the right to assign this contract at any time prior to closing and buyer's sole subjective discretion, right? Now, that being said, that might be something that, a seller looks at and goes, well, what the heck is going on, right? So maybe you want to avoid that. And I guess before we even go any further, right, is there a little bit of a stigma as far as an LLC purchasing a property versus, a typical set of buyers, let's say? Well, unfortunately, the answer probably is yes, right? Which in my opinion is I'll just say it's stupid, right? I mean, I want my sellers to make a business decision. And if the best offer for them is to take an offer from an LLC or, some investor or whatever it is, right? Like, why would I advise them to take anything else? Now, that doesn't mean that an investor offer is always the best offer. Certainly you could have an owner occupant who is, better qualified or willing to offer more or whatever the case may be, right? And in that case, then take the owner occupied offer, right? But people have these, these thoughts of like, well, I loved my neighbors and I don't want it to get turned into a rental. Well, that's all fine and good, but what happens if you sell it to, the set of buyers that are taking title as, joint tenants as individuals, as opposed to investors, and it turns out they manufacture meth in the property. Like, is that your fault? Right? What happens if they lose their job and they have to sell and they take an investor offer a year later? Like, you have no control over what happens after closing. So why would you make a decision that would shortchange yourself to benefit your neighbors? It's just mind-boggling to me that the things that people do, or these thoughts that they have, like I just don't understand, right? And like, yeah, I love my neighbors too, but I'm looking out for me. And I'm sorry if like that's offensive to somebody, but it's my property, it's my investment, and I'm going to make the most of my investment, right? So is there a little bit of a stigma? Unfortunately, yes, because people are humans. That being said, I always advise my sellers to just make a business decision and take what's best for them, because you can't control what happens after closing, right? So there is a little bit of a workaround, which normally I don't talk about until we get down to the deed section. But we can talk about it real quick since we're talking about it. There is a possibility. So if we look at the deed section, let me get back into the contract here. So down in section 13 is where it talks about the different types of deeds. And so we've got special warranty, general warranty, bargain and sale, and quit claim deed. And then a personal representative's deed is really just a bargain and sale deed by another name. So we'll talk about that later. But what a bargain and sale deed is, it's basically a quit claim deed with one extra little piece to it, right? A quit claim deed says, hey, Brandy, like, I'm going to transfer whatever portion of ownership I have in this property right now to you, okay? And so I don't, let's say Brandy lives at 123 Main Street and she owns that house. Okay. What I could do is I could give Brandy a quit claim deed that says, hey, Brandy, I'm going to sell you the property at 123 Main Street, or not sell, but I'm going to transfer whatever portion of ownership I own in 123 Main Street to you. Right. Well, that's all fine and good, but I don't own anything in 123 Main Street right now, right? If Brandy owns that house, then me transferring her a quit claim deed for her own house does nothing for Brandy, right? What bargain and sale deed does is it includes one extra piece that's called after acquired title. And so what I could do is I could say, hey, Brandy, I'm going to transfer to you my, or forget Brandy, let's say Liz. Right? Liz, I'm going to give you a bargain and sale deed for 123 Main Street. Okay. And even though I don't currently own any portion of 123 Main Street, if I ever came into any portion of ownership in 123 Main Street, that would pass directly from me to Liz. So there's a possibility that what you could do to avoid it would be, write buyers' names on title, right? Mr. and Mrs. Smith or whatever, and then have them fill out a bargain and sale deed, right, to the property that they are purchasing that they do not own yet. And they are going to transfer that property to whatever the LLC is, right? And then at closing, when Mr. and Mrs. Smith purchase that property, it automatically transfers to the LLC. Okay, now be careful. That's like, you got to get an attorney involved. And I don't ever want you guys to advise your clients to do this. Is that in violation of the bad faith clause of the contract? Arguable, right? So if they're going to do that, they need to go talk to an attorney. And if they're not willing to spend a couple $100 to go have an attorney, explain all this stuff to them, then you are not the cheap free legal advice, right? You're taking on liability by doing that. There may be other consequences and other things to consider as far as the contract goes. So I don't want you guys to be the cheap free legal advice that they're just leaning on you for. Okay. That makes sense. Those are probably your best options. Okay. Let's see. So we talked about assignability. Seller, obviously you need to have all of the seller's names. If there's multiple sellers on title, you need to have them all listed in 2.3. It really doesn't do a lot of good for, one seller to sign everything if the other seller hasn't signed. There are a couple of cases in Colorado where courts have actually upheld that one seller's, initial or signature on the contract was sufficient for both, but that is not the norm. And there were some extenuating circumstances there. So make sure that you get all the sellers' names as they appear on title of the property, right? List them all here, okay? If you're working with the buyer, how do you figure that out? Well, you can just go into public records typically, and you can find it. You can also get an ownership and encumbrance report, which is not a bad idea as the buyer's broker. You should always be doing it as the listing broker, but not a bad idea if you're the buyer's broker as well. And then you can make sure, hey, like the seller is who they say they are. These are the people that are on title. Here's any outstanding liens or encumbrances against the property that, we may have to make sure that the seller is aware of these things, right? And that can cause wrinkles in your transaction later if they don't get taken care of. So not a terrible idea to get an ownership and encumbrance report. There are also some legislative changes that may take place that might make it even more important to get an ownership and encumbrance report. I'm not going to go into in depth yet because it hasn't happened yet, but part of what an ownership and encumbrance report will have is it will have the actual legal description of the property, which is what you're going to put here in section 2.4. Okay. Most of the legal descriptions that we pull are truly abbreviated legal descriptions. And again, we'll see, how this legislation plays out, but it may become more and more important to get the actual legal description as opposed to an abbreviated legal description. I don't think it's going to be, anything that causes a bunch of waves, but it may be a thing that affects your business. So you need to know about it if that, happens down the road. But what I do recommend always is make sure that you are actually looking at the legal description in the MLS to make sure that it matches with the legal description that's in public records. And so the reason that I say this is let me pull up a different screen here. Share this here. So I typically share these out of Berthoud just because it's very prevalent in Berthoud. But this happens in many places, particularly in downtown type areas that are very old, where they used to have these really long, narrow lots, right? And so if you look at the legal description for this property, the property's address is 135 Mountain Avenue in Berthoud. Okay, and if you look at this legal description, it says lots 11 through 14 of block number 1 of the Welch subdivision of Berthoud. Okay, so effectively you've got 4 separate lots that make up 135 Mountain Avenue. Okay, and so let me pull up a quick overview here and I'll show you what that looks like and why this is important. So here's the overview of what this property looks like. Okay, and so you can see, so if you were to count, right, here's lot 1. Can you guys see the little dashed lines on your screen? I don't know if you guys can see it or not, but
Yes.
You've got some like thicker outlines around the whole property, but then you've got these little dashed lines, right? And so if you were to count, this is lot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, right? So this is where this property starts. Lot 11, 12, 13, 14, right? And you can see where the house is built right here. Doesn't really go on lot 11 at all. It kind of abuts pretty close to it. And it doesn't go on lot 14 either. And so you got to be a little bit careful because someone, could potentially put in the listing service, hey, we're selling 135 Mountain Avenue. And maybe in the legal description, they put lots 11 through 13. Okay. And keep in mind that property is transferred via the legal description, not the known as street address. So 135 Mountain Avenue is going to be your known as street address, but the legal description for this whole property is lots 11 through 14 of block 1 of the Welch subdivision, right? So if in your contract it says lots 11 through 13, right? Effectively, what you've done is you've given your clients the property to this dotted line right here, and they don't own what they thought they, that they were purchasing with this extra little parcel, right? Or what if they sold you lots 12 through 14? Then they may not have a driveway. Or even worse, right? What happens if you didn't look at the legal description and it says lots 11, 12, and 14 of, this subdivision? Well, then you're getting lot 11, 12, and 14. And, a quarter of your house is built on lot 13. Well, now if somebody is the legal owner of lot 13 of this property, right? Now your client has a problem. And after closing, they call you up and they're like, hey, this person's still claiming ownership, some ownership interest in the property, right? That's a bad day and not one that, I want you guys to get yourselves into. Now, would any of that hold up in court? I don't know. I mean, you could say that was in violation of the bad faith clause of the contract, particularly if you're reserving one of the lots that the house is built on, right? But it would be much harder to prove if it was lot 11 or lot 14, where, the seller says, no, I intentionally reserved that for myself because I have future plans with that particular, long, narrow lot, whatever it might happen to be. Okay. So you should always check the legal description to make sure that it matches up to what you reasonably expected it would be. Okay. Now I'm going to share a different one because that's a lot and block legal description, which is probably what most of the properties that you're going to sell are going to have, is a lot and block legal description. However, if you're selling acreage that's, old acreage, right, that's not lot and block, it's probably going to have what's called a meets and bounds legal description. And if you're not familiar with meets and bounds, effectively what it is they say, oh, beginning at this point and then going in this direction for this length and then this direction for this length, right? And in some cases, like those points of reference are like to the old oak tree. Well, the old oak tree may not exist anymore, right? And so these meets and bounds legal descriptions can be very confusing. And this is what a meets and bounds legal description looks like. And this was for a property that I sold. And effectively what it says is, beginning at a point on the north line of the right of way of highway 34, and then going in all of these directions at this distance, right? And then back to a point of beginning that's approximately at the center line of the handy ditch, right? Like, how are you ever going to verify it, right? There's no way that anyone in this meeting, unless you're a certified surveyor or something, that you're ever going to be able to figure out where boundary lines are, what exactly this is. But what you can do is you can at least make sure that what's being, advertised in the MLS is what's listed here, right? And so just to give you an idea of what this property looks like, let me share the screen here. So it's this property right here. There's like a house and then there's like a little caretaker's apartment on it. And basically it goes, you probably can't see it, but there's a little tiny line right here. And it basically goes, kind of up to this is a cliff or like a rock face, right? And it goes up to like right above here and then kind of carries down into the center line of the handy ditch, which runs along right here. Okay, this is a ditch along Highway 34. And so it kind of, careens down over to the center line of this handy ditch. And then it comes out right here, right, to some point on Highway 34. Well, what happened with the canyon back when the, Big Thompson flooded? Highway 34 was wiped out, right? So what if this section of highway was wiped out? What if they widen the highway? Then where does that, boundary line go to? It's very difficult to determine where that's at. So nobody expects you to, be fully versed on, what a surveyor needs to know and understand, right? But you do need to make sure that you're at least looking at the legal description, because what if the listing broker copied the wrong legal description out of the MLS? What if they are only selling 3 of those 4 parcels or 2 of those 4 parcels, right? Just not a good situation to be in. So do your due diligence and, make sure that your client is aware. Susie chatted in and she said, would you recommend having this surveyed? So certainly it's something that is not a bad idea to advise, right? That your client have the property surveyed if they're concerned about the exact location. In this case, right, this guy really wasn't concerned. There's fairly well-defined fences. Whether those fences are even close to the actual lot lines or not, who knows, right? Like those things were probably put up back in the early 1800s and have probably moved several times since then. So I don't know. I mean, if your client's concerned about it, then yeah, I advise them to get it surveyed. In this case, the guy didn't care. He purchased the property without it, and that's okay too.
Is that the place that was the old leather shop?
Yeah, Beaver's Den Leather.
Yeah.
That was an interesting story.
Oh yeah.
Not going to tell you in this class, but so Andrew chimed in. He said thoughts on comparing the last deed description. And so part of the ownership and encumbrance report is that it will have a copy of the vesting deed for the property. So it will actually have the legal description that's associated with that vesting deed. And so I would prefer, that you go off of that O&E. It's okay to look at, the last, and I don't know where you're pulling this deed description from, Andrew, but I wouldn't recommend going into the MLS and just saying, oh, hey, this is what the last listing broker listed it as, and this is what they have it listed as, again today, because what happens if it's been, subdivided in the meantime, right? Obviously, if it's a lot and block type thing, that's only suitable for one house, that's probably not going to be the case. But, I sold a 14.5 acre parcel that we subdivided into a 12-acre parcel and a 2.5 acre parcel. And so if you were to just compare the last deed transfer, it would have had the full 14.5 acre legal description on it. Whereas when we sold it, we were selling two separate pieces, 2.5 acres with the house and 12 acres of vacant land. Does that make sense? So is it okay to compare? Yeah. Is it the best? I would just get the vesting deed for the property and do your best to line it up with public records. Again, like in some cases, it's going to be difficult on some of those meets and bounds legal descriptions to do that, but at least do your due diligence and try. Okay. So in addition to the legal description, right, and it is important to insert the county here, which we do see people miss from time to time. They'll put, the legal description, they'll put the address, but they forget to put the county. Put it in there. Don't forget that. Put the legal description, and then you'll put the street address as well. So your 123 Main Street, Fort Collins, Colorado, 80524, whatever. Okay. So that, is the property is the following legally described property that you're listing here. This is really just for informational purposes, but the property, capital P, right? The property also, it's the legal description together with any interest, easements, rights, benefits, improvements, and attached fixtures pertinent thereto, right? And all this other stuff. So that is how we define the property with a capital P, okay? Section 2.4. And then we get to the inclusions, right? And so it's a little bit confusing because in 2.4, right, it says that the legally described property plus all of these things, including attached fixtures, right? And so people get in their mind like, okay, if it's attached, it stays. If it's not attached, then, the seller has the right to take it. And that's not entirely true, right? If we look at the inclusion section, right, in 2.5, it tells us there's some inclusions which we're going to list standard, which we are considering to be attached, okay? But then there's also inclusions that are standard inclusions per our contract that are considered to be not attached to the property, but they are, unless otherwise specified under exclusions, those are required to stay per the contract, okay? And so 2.5.1 is pretty straightforward, right? We, lighting, heating, plumbing, HVAC, all that other stuff that you would typically expect would stay. There's some weird stuff in here like plants and mirrors, right? Like plants, we're not talking about like, hey, you have some, potted plants sitting in your kitchen window. Like that's not what we're talking about. Talking about plants that are growing in the ground, right? Mirrors, again, we're not talking about floor mirrors that are, just sitting on the floor. We're talking about the ones that are attached to the wall in the bathroom, right? Those are the mirrors that stay. Floor coverings, again, like if you have an area rug, that's not a floor covering that we're talking about, right? But you can't pull up carpet that's attached to the floor, that's stuck down with tack strips and everything else. You can't take your wood floor out with you, right? Those are what we're talking about here, okay? But then we get, and I'll come back to this stuff, but then we get down to these inclusions that are not attached, right? Things like storm windows, storm doors, window and porch shades, awnings, blinds, screens, right? And these blind screens, window coverings and treatments, curtain rods, these are the ones that always seem to like make people go sideways on these deals. They're like, oh, I didn't realize I was going to have to leave my curtains that grandma gave me for my wedding, right? And there's some emotional attachment, and lo and behold, buyers like, no, that was an important part of my purchase decision, was to have those beautiful curtains, right? And it's always some excuse, and then people want to fight about it, and then it gets ugly and your transaction goes south because of some window coverings, right? So make sure your seller is aware that unless they specifically exclude their window coverings, those things are standard inclusions per the contract, right? And that's everything from blinds to screens to curtain rods, drapery rods, curtains, drapes, shears, whatever you want to call them, right? Those are all window coverings and treatments, okay? So those are considered to be not attached, but standard inclusions to the property. The other one is storage sheds. If you guys weren't here last week, I think we talked about the chicken coop last week. Ugly situation, right? Chicken coop is not listed in here. We had a deal, and I'm not going to go back and rehash everything, but a deal where, there was a chicken coop on the property. Seller asked the buyer if they wanted it. Buyer said they don't want the chickens. Seller heard, I don't want the chicken coop. So seller got rid of the chicken coop. Buyer claimed they wanted it. Buyer claimed that it was a storage shed. It was a storage shed for chickens. And it's like, I don't really there's various arguments. I could absolutely see that thing going either way. So if you have something like a chicken coop or, shelving units that you think are going to stay, right? Those items that are not listed there, put them in your contract specifically as either inclusions or exclusions if you don't see them in the list of standard inclusions or exclusions, okay? Super important for section 2.5.1 is these boxes here. So if these boxes are checked, the following are owned by the seller and included in the transaction, okay? So the biggie is going to be solar panels. Water softener systems are not as common, but they are expensive. And so if you're dealing with one, it's important to know. But solar panels, as they become more prevalent, are starting to create more issues, okay? And so there's a couple different things you need to know as far as solar panels go. One is that, you have owned systems and you have leased systems, okay? The other thing you need to know is that it is possible to have an owned system, but have payments on it because you borrowed money in order to purchase that owned system. So just like buying a house, right? Many people cannot afford to just pay cash. So they go get a loan for the house, right? Same thing with the solar panels. They go get a loan for the solar panels, but they own the system just like they own the house, even though they're making payments on a mortgage or a deed of trust in Colorado, technically, right? So if it's owned, but there are still payments being made on it, you can still check this box, right? That says that they're, the solar panels are owned. However, it is important that you list, right? Any personal property must be conveyed at closing by seller free and clear of any taxes, liens, and encumbrances, except if you're going to transfer that owned solar panel system subject to payments on the loan, where the buyer is going to take over the payments on the loan, that needs to be listed here. If you do not list it here, then effectively what you're saying, if you check that solar panel box, is that the seller is going to pay off that balance, whatever is left on that solar panel loan, okay? And if it's leased, you should not check this box at all. That would get listed down under due diligence documents. Okay. So super, super important. I mean, especially if it's a leased system, you don't ever want to check this box, because that means your seller has to pay, effectively pay off the entirety of the solar panel lease, right, in order to purchase them from whatever company it is that owns it. Another super important thing is that not all solar loans on these solar panels, not all loans are assignable or assumable. And so it may not be possible for the buyer to assume that solar loan, even if the seller wants to do it and the buyer wants to do it. The company that holds the note for that solar loan might say, nope, we're not allowing it to be transferred. It has to be paid off at closing.
So
Okay.
Jesse, just to make sure I get this right.
Yep.
So under 2.5.3, we would put except the solar panels.
Well, the solar panel loan, 2.5.3 is talking about what liens and encumbrances are going to exist on this personal property at the time of closing that the buyer is going to take over. So the solar panels themselves, you would check this box if it's an owned system, whether there's payments or not, right?
Yeah,
You would check this box. Yep. And then 2.5.3 is where you would put the solar panel loan, with the remaining balance of $20,154 or whatever it is, right?
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yep.
Anyone else have questions about this? Because this is a huge, I don't know, it's creating huge issues in our industry right now, because brokers are not terribly well versed in it. Sellers think, oh, it's going to be easy to just, transfer it all to the buyer. It may not be easy to transfer to the buyer. So you should be doing some due diligence up front if the home has solar panels, if you're listing it, right? And figure out, okay, can the buyer assume this? Does the buyer want to assume this, right? In many cases, if I have the buyer, I ask for the solar panels to be included with no liens or encumbrances against them. I want the seller to pay off the entire system at closing, right?
I lived the
See-
dream on a personal basis right here.
Angela had a rough experience. Okay.
Yep. Real life.
Let's see. Susie asked if we can do a solar class. So if you guys don't know Janelle McGill in the Fort Collins office, she actually has a CE class for solar. And I'll chat her name in here. You can look her up. I forget, it's either McGill. Yeah, I don't think there's
Right.
an MAC. So you guys can look her up and ask her when her next solar class is. And she's amazing. She knows way more about solar than I ever would. I know enough to be dangerous as far as the contract goes, but that's about it. So look for Janelle McGill and see when she's doing her class, and you actually get CE credit. Whereas unfortunately, you just listen to me and get nothing for it in this class. So sorry about that. How do you find out the status of paid or loan from the listing broker? So unfortunately, in many cases, the listing broker probably hasn't done their due diligence either, and they probably don't know. So solar panel loans typically get recorded in the UCC. And if you guys have taken the manufactured homes class recently, you know that, a manufactured home, or what you and I have typically referred to as a mobile home, right? That's not real property. A mobile home is not considered real property. It's personal property, and liens against personal property get recorded in the UCC, which is kind of like a lien being recorded in public records if it's attached to real property. So always good to ask the listing broker just straight up, like, hey, is this an owned system or is it a lease system? And is the seller making payments on it, or is it paid off? Hopefully they at least know that, right? And unfortunately, in some cases, they just don't. Good idea to, look through the UCC, and that's not really something you as a broker should do. That is something that your buyer should do. And really, they're not going to be well versed in that process. And so again, good idea to recommend legal counsel to look through the UCC to see if there's any outstanding liens or encumbrances against the solar panels. If they're going to be taking on a $30,000 system, they should be willing to spend $300 or whatever it's going to cost for an attorney to go review it and make sure that it's all free and clear, right? Now, that being said, if you write your contract that, hey, the solar panels are going to be included and it's all going to be paid off at closing anyway, then maybe no harm, no foul as far as, making that, making your contract that way. Just make sure title is aware that, hey, you may have to collect for solar panels here, right?
Jesse, the forms or that document that Janelle goes over, can you request that somewhere? I mean, if a lot of people still aren't aware of this, would you request that in your due diligence document?
Well, so
Put it somewhere else? I don't know.
So you have to be a little bit careful, right? If you're asking the system to be paid off, you're still going to check that it's included. Now you can still ask for documents regarding the solar, the solar panels in the due diligence documents. But what you don't want to do, right, if it's a lease system and you're expecting it to be paid off, you don't want to skip checking the box there and then just go down and list it in due diligence documents, because then you're taking on a lease system, right? Let's see. Angela says the listing agent on the house we bought with the solar was the owner too. Yeah, and just a perfect example that, right, like brokers are not well versed in solar. It's just not a big enough thing out here. And I think so. I hesitate a little bit to tell you this, right? Because so Janelle is a good friend of mine, and she's an awesome human being. If you guys don't know Janelle, she's like the sweetest person in the world. She and I have a maybe disagreement as far as the value of solar, right? Janelle is very much a green person, and while I have nothing against solar or wind or anything else, right? It's just not at a point where, in my opinion, it makes sense from a financial perspective, solely financial perspective, right? To go pay $30,000 for solar panels. It's just not a cost you're ever going to recoup, at least not right now. Okay. Maybe as the cost of electricity rises and, the value or the cost of, installing solar panels on your home goes down. Like, I'm not saying we're not going to get there, but at least right now, in my opinion, it's just not worth it. And if you go into like the national conversation and look at what's happening as far as solar, most appraisers are just not assigning any value for solar panels, right? And so most appraisers are saying, hey, there's really not much of a difference with respect to the sale price of a home that has solar and a home that has no solar. Okay. Now, there are appraisers who are there's a certification for being able to appraise solar panels. And if you're the listing broker, if I'm the listing broker, even if I don't believe in the value of solar panels from a financial, strictly from a financial perspective, right, it is possible that I can effectively not permit any appraisers to go into the property unless they are certified to appraise a solar panel system, right? And so you do need to know where to look. You will get all of that from Janelle's class. I've got it, but I'm not going to go over everything in this class. So just know, even regardless of what your thoughts on the value of solar are, you as the listing broker, as a value to your seller, know that there is an option where you can request a solar certified appraiser be the one who appraises the property, because that they will assign some kind of value to an owned system. If it's a lease system, they probably still will not assign any value. But if it is owned, then you should at least see some value return there, which is going to be helpful, particularly in this market, right? For you to have as much value as you can to get your property to appraise. Okay. So not going to go crazy in depth on that. Go take Janelle's solar class and she'll talk to you about it for a couple hours, and you'll get some CE credits for it as well. Okay. Let's see. Water softener systems, the same way. Security systems and satellite systems are just not as common anymore, particularly now that many security systems are wireless, right? But it is important that you check, right? Because if the home has a security system, is that included or is it excluded? Well, what it says is if these boxes are checked, then they're included, right? But if they're not checked, then does that mean that it's not included? I mean, presumably, yes, that is the case. But, if the seller wants to make sure, I'd still go down and list it as an exclusion if they want to take their, security cameras or their door chimes or whatever it is that they have. Okay. And then the last little piece is if there's any additional items that get attached to the property after the date of the contract, then those items would be included in the purchase price as well. Okay. Again, not going to read over everything here. Storage sheds are already listed. Again, this is another one of those weird things. It's already listed as an inclusion. And so when we get down here to parking and storage facilities, right, people will come down here and they'll say the following storage facilities, the storage shed in the backyard. Like it doesn't hurt, but you don't need it. And that's not what this section is asking. Okay. So if you're not sure, just go back to 2.5.1 and 2.5.2 and say, hey, are these things standard inclusions or are they not? And if there's something that's attached to the property and you're like, well, I don't know, it's not listed there, right? Just clarify as either an other inclusion or clarify it in exclusions, whatever your buyer or seller's preference is, so that there's no question, once buyers doing their final walkthrough and it's like, hey, you took the hanging storage racks out of the garage. Well, I don't know. Did they have a right to do that or did they not? It's not listed in our contract, but do you really want to take the chance of having a judge be the one to decide for you? Probably not, right? So just clarify, it will prevent some headaches later, okay? Again, if any of that personal property is being transferred with any liens and encumbrances, like solar panels, like a water softener system, right? You would list those here. Otherwise, if this says none and the solar panels box is checked, effectively what you're saying is buyer expects the solar panels to be completely paid off at closing. Okay. Now, yes, you could also go down to additional provisions and you could list in additional provisions, hey, in regards to section 2.5.1, buyers assuming the solar panel loan, like that's okay too. But this is really why they put this section in here. Okay. Conveyance of all personal property will be by bill of sale or other legal applicable legal instrument. We'll talk about the personal property agreement here in a minute, but obviously whatever's included is going to be transferred via bill of sale. For personal property, it's transferred by deed for legal, real property. Okay. Other inclusions. So if you have a loan involved in your transaction, you have to be a little bit careful about what you're putting in here, right? Totally okay to put, the fridge, the stove, the oven, the dishwasher, the disposal, whatever appliances, washer, dryer. Okay. Those are all okay because those are kind of standard in a real estate transaction, right? However, if you have a fully furnished unit, which I was talking to someone the other day and they're like, hey, we want to sell this thing fully furnished. How do we do that? Well, you can market it as a fully furnished unit in the MLS, right? And that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. But if the buyer has a lender, does the buyer's lender have any collateral against the couches and the TVs and the dishes and the towels and the whatever? No. Right? The lender's only collateral is the real property. They don't have collateral against the personal property, and the personal property can grow, it can grow legs and walk out, right? It could be sold, all this other stuff. So a couple things you need to know is if there's a lender involved, they're not going to want to see all of those things listed in the other inclusions, right? They're going to go, hey, is your purchase price of $750,000, is that for the real property or is that for the real property plus the personal property? Because if it's for both, I'm not going to lend you, 80% or whatever of that 750. We're going to base it on the value of the real property, not anything having to do with personal property. And so how do you then get around that? Well, the real estate commission created a personal property agreement form, which we're not going to look at the whole form, but there is a form for that. And effectively what it says is buyer or, seller agrees to sell all of these items to the buyer, which is contingent upon the closing of the property. But the purchase price of the personal property is separate from and in addition to the purchase price of the real property. Okay. And so, if you were offering $750 and you determined that all that personal property was worth $10,000, right? You can either do $750 as the offer for the real property plus another $10,000 in cash, because you're not going to get a loan on it, $10,000 in cash at closing for the personal property, or you could say, hey, we'll give you $400 or $740,000 for the real property, plus an additional $10,000 in cash for personal property as well. So of course, right, brokers are like, well, we just want to be $750,000 all in. And so we will make the value of this personal property $10, right? And so they say, for $10, another good and valuable consideration, which is how attorneys talk, and that's what bills of sale say. So for $10, another good and valuable consideration, the seller's going to sell, the TVs and the, surround sound and the beds and the couches and, all of the furnishings, the artwork, all this other stuff. Two problems with that. One, what happens if the seller, during the time you're closing on the property, the seller hires his buddies to go take all of the personal property out of the property, right? Buyer closes on it, goes, and it's completely vacant. Buyer sues, okay, goes before a judge, and the judge says, okay, seller, you were supposed to deliver all this personal property, and you didn't. I see that you have a personal property agreement that says it's for $10 and other good and valuable consideration. Seller, give the buyer their $10 and get out of my courtroom. Well, is that what your buyer wanted? Probably not, right? And the other problem with it is it's loan fraud, which is a federal offense. Okay. You don't want to be included in some kind of federal case where you helped your buyer to commit loan fraud by defrauding the lender, by trying to get them to wrap the value of the personal property into the purchase price of the property. Okay. Now, does that mean that you have to determine a market value or a retail value or something else? The answer is no, right? You're probably talking about garage sale value for most of these items, unless we're talking about like valuable artwork or something like that, right? But we're probably talking about garage sale value, and whatever value it is that would make your buyer comfortable receiving that money if the seller were to default by selling all of that crap while you were at closing, right? And a judge awarding your buyer whatever that amount happens to be. Okay, if your buyer says, I'm good with $10, right? I don't care whether they take it or whether they leave it. It makes no difference to me. If I got $10 for it, if I had to sue the seller, and I got $10, then that would be great. Which if that was the case, there would be no point suing the seller to get your $10, right? That doesn't make financial sense. Okay, but if they're okay with $10, then fine. Effectively, what they're saying is my offer is not contingent upon the seller leaving these things. If they happen to leave it, then great. And if they take it, that's okay too. But my offer of $750 is for the real property, right? That's okay. But if that's not the case, then don't do a $10 bill of sale for a bunch of personal property. Okay. So you guys have questions on that? Because this is where brokers start to like get all these bright ideas and think that they're gonna, figure out a way to commit loan fraud without getting caught. And that's not a very good strategy. So don't commit loan fraud, I guess, it would be my advice to you. If there is no lender, then you can write everything in 2.5.4 that you want. Nobody cares. If it's all included in the purchase price, it's all included in the purchase price. Doesn't matter whether it's in addition to or not, right? Slam it all in 2.5.4, and whatever your contract price is includes everything that's in here. Okay. If you are going to do a separate personal property agreement outside of this contract, you would check this box, right? And then you would come up with a number that the buyer is willing to give the seller for whatever all of that personal property is, but they need to know that it is in addition to the purchase price that's listed here in section 4 of the contract, right? So be careful about that. It's in addition to. So questions on that personal property agreement? Okay. Section 2.5.5 talks about parking and storage facilities. So again, it doesn't hurt to put like the attached 2-car, 3-car garage in here. That being said, that is automatically included. The seller has no right to take the attached 2-car garage with them, right? Nobody would in their right mind would consider that to be a thing. You don't need to put it in here. Typically, all I put is any assigned per deed for both. Okay. Really the reason that this section exists is when we're talking about condos, right, or townhomes, right? In some cases, there may be some parking facilities, whether it's a garage, whether it's just covered parking, an assigned parking space, right? That is where we would list whatever, the buyer's, parking is going to be. That's what we would list there. Same thing with storage units. For some of these condos and townhomes, they have a separate little storage facility or a storage locker where a particular storage unit is assigned to an individual homeowner, right? And you could put that in that section. Again, a storage shed is already included in the standard inclusions per the contract. You do not need to list that. If there's some kind of, storage facility, storage unit, storage locker, parking, assigned parking space, covered parking space, garages that are actually owned by the association that are not owned by the unit owner, right? That's what we're talking about in that section in the contract, okay? You'll see that, so this little note to buyer was actually added the last time they revised the contract. And effectively what it says is if the exact rights to the parking and storage facilities is a concern to the buyer, then the buyer should investigate. The way it used to be was there was a box that you could check that said either ownership or use only of the following parking facilities and ownership or use only of the following storage facilities. And you had to check the box. But the problem with that was that, particularly with garage units, there are many associations where the association actually owns the garages, particularly if they're detached, and not in all cases, but in some, the association owns those garages, not the unit owner. Even if, unit 103 is the only person who can use this one garage unit, and even if it says unit 103 on it, right, it may still be owned by the association. And so the reason they took the check boxes out and added this little blurb at the bottom was because sellers thought, oh, I own the garage, right? And so the brokers were writing the contracts and they would check the box that says ownership of the following parking facilities, garage unit 103. So seller then sells the property, buyer's like starting to read the HOA docs and they're like, hey, it turns out I don't actually own the garage unit, but our contract said that you were selling me the ownership of the garage unit. So now you need to go purchase the garage from the association, and that's going to cost you, $30,000, or we can settle outside of court by you paying me $20,000. Right? It was like, oh no. Well, then who do you think that the seller was turning it back against? Their own listing broker. They're like, you advised me on this contract. You're the one who advised me to check this, and now it's your problem as the broker. Okay. So that was a great change that they took that out of there. Now it basically just says, buyer, if you're concerned about whether it's use only or ownership, you go investigate, you read the HOA docs, that's on you, right? And so the important takeaway there is if you're working with the buyer, you need to have your buyer reading the HOA docs if that's a concern for them. And really, whether that is a concern for them or not, they should be reading the HOA docs if they're purchasing a home in a homeowner association. Okay. 2.5.6 talks about the exclusions, right? If there's something, one thing you definitely do not need to put in here is the seller's personal property. Okay. Couple things. One is our contract is for real property, right? And two is that section 2.5.3 says any personal property must be conveyed at closing by seller free and clear of any taxes, liens, and encumbrances, except whatever you list there, right? And so then if you come down here and you say, hey, the seller's personal property is going to be excluded, well, then does that mean that if some of these pieces up here, even though they're standard inclusions, if they could be considered personal property, does that mean that the seller doesn't have to leave them because we put seller's personal property would be excluded, right? Now, there's a lot of brokers out there who just don't understand that concept, and they're like, oh, hey, you didn't put that the seller's personal property would be excluded. Well, you can have the conversation with them and tell them, hey, we don't need to. The property or the contract is for real property, not personal property. Or if they just refuse, right, then you could put the seller's personal belongings, just because personal property is referenced a lot. And even though it's not truly defined because it's not capitalized, it is in the heading for this section, right? And it could be considered to be a defined term. So you have to be a little bit careful about what you put in there. You really shouldn't put the seller's personal belongings, the seller's personal property, because none of that stuff is, included standard in our contract anyway, right? The only time you need to address exclusions is if there is something that would be a standard inclusion listed here or elsewhere in the contract that the sellers would like to take with them, right? And so the example would be like the Tiffany lamp over the dining room, the table, right? Oh, that was, a gift handed down from my grandma. Like, we installed that when we moved in and we intend to take it with us when we move out. Like, okay, it would standard be an inclusion. And if you're going to take it, then come down here and list it in the exclusions. Otherwise, we don't need to put the personal property, personal belongings, right? But I would be super careful about putting personal property in there because it's addressed in a separate section in our contract. Okay. Any questions about that piece? Okay. 2.7 is where we talk about water rights. So a couple things to know about water rights. One is if the home is already hooked up to a municipal water source, right? City of Fort Collins water, Fort Collins Loveland Water District, whatever it is, that's not the types of water rights that we're talking about. Okay. 2.7.1 talks about deeded water rights. And so there are some types of water that are legally described and they are deeded just like with a deed to a property, right? So they have an actual deed that goes with them. So if that's the case, you would check this box. If there are some type of legally described deeded water rights, you need to get an attorney involved, okay? I did a deal. It was 114 acres of land. It had kind of a 1970s, house on it, nothing super special. And then it had like a little 1920s kind of bungalow, which was like farmhand quarters, right? And along with this 114 acres were 10 shares of North Pooter water, okay? The total purchase price of this whole 114 acres with 10 shares of North Pooter at the time was $1.54 million. And of that 1.54 million, you want to know how much was just for water? It's like $990,000 was water. Okay. If somebody has $1 million to spend on water, do you think they should have an attorney review what they're actually getting as far as their water rights go? Everybody shake your head. Yes. Right. And today that same water is probably worth over $2 million or close to 2 million. Okay. Water is extremely valuable. It is extremely expensive. If they have $1 million to spend on water, they can have an attorney look at it as well. Okay. Again, you guys need to not be the cheap, free legal, like, oh, let me look into this. Let me tell you how much water you're going to get with one share or whatever, right? That is way beyond the scope of real estate brokerage. Okay. Other rights relating to water. So you might have like, an example, again, separate section, but water stock certificates. If you guys have never seen water stock certificates, like any of your, like when, I don't know, when Harry was a kid, maybe, but like for me, when I was a kid, my grandparents would get me these bonds, right? And they look, they have all this like official government, printed stuff on there. Anybody still have like the old school bonds, right? Like my dad has a folder and it has all these old bonds in there, right? Like that's kind of what water stock certificates look like, but it has the name of the water, company or whatever on there. So there's various different types of water. And so whatever types of water you're dealing with, shares of a ditch company, running rights to use somebody's ditch, right? Those should be spelled out here. The one thing that, is an area that you probably don't have to get an attorney in would be if there's well rights. Okay. If there's a well on the property, you can check this box and put the well permit number. Always try to get the well permit number if you can. The Division of Water Resources is where you would go to find the well number and the permit number and what is allowed, what the allowable use is for that well. And it's a little bit more user-friendly now than it used to be, but it's still not super easy to navigate. So always best to just get the well number if you can, because it's much easier if you have it to just go in there, pop in the well number, and then pull it up. Okay. It is important to know that some wells, but really all wells for the most part, have restrictions as far as what they can be used for. So some of them might be for, household use only. And if that's the case, then, we're talking interior use only, cooking, showering, bathing, whatever. Some of them might allow you to water up to an acre of land, right? And if that's the case, then okay, you can water up to an acre of land. Some of it might allow for you to use for livestock purposes, okay? And it is important to know that if you have a well on the property, your buyer needs to be aware of what the allowable uses are. They can't just say, oh, like nobody's ever going to know, like I'll just use it for whatever I want to use it for. Because the way that they get caught is the neighbors' wells will potentially run dry, right? If somebody, uses too much water, the neighbor's wells might start to run dry. They call up the Division of Water Resources and say, hey, kind of weird, after this house sold, all of a sudden our wells have been running dry. We don't know what's going on, but can you come investigate? Division of Water Resources will typically investigate. In many cases, they will go fly drones over property and they'll say, hey, it looks like you're watering land that you're really not supposed to be doing. And we're going to come and we're going to plug your well. Okay. And then they will come and plug the well if the user is doing something that's outside of their, allowable scope of water usage. Okay. So if you have a property that's on a well, do not just tell your client like, oh, hey, it's not a metered well, so you can do whatever the heck you want with it. No, that's incorrect. And sooner or later, they will probably get caught. Okay. So make sure you know what the allowable uses are. It will state the allowable uses on the face of the permit, right? And in many cases, it will say not to exceed a certain amount of water per year, or whatever period of time. So make sure your clients are paying attention to that, guys. It's super important. Okay. Again, in
Jesse,
most, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, quick question about that. If the seller has the deed that has the water permit number, I've seen it, a piece of paper with the permit number on it, the well permit number on it, is that okay to use?
Yeah, so careful, because we're not talking about the deed. The deed is separate, right? But if they have
Right.
the well permit that has the permit number on it,
Right.
then it's easy to just go into the Division of Water Resources and look it up by the permit number. So yes, that's okay. Still a good idea to call the water, not you, but probably your buyers. Call the Division of Water Resources. Make sure that, hey, this is the actual correct permit number for this property. Here are the allowable uses. Here's the maximum amount of water I can use. Right? Make sure that it's going to work for whatever it is that they need it to work for. Because if that's its only source of water, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, the last people had 2 people, and I have a family of 6, and it's not enough water for me to, effectively use my house, then the house is worthless to me. Right? So, but yeah, the well permit will have the well permit number on there. And sometimes it'll have like -A at the end. And so there's been revisions or something like that. So make sure you have all the correct info, make sure that it's the right one. But yeah, good idea to still advise your client to call the Division of Water Resources, make sure that it's, actually a permitted well, make sure that's the well that goes with the property, make sure that they can use it for what they thought they were going to use it for and use as much of it as they expect to use. Okay. Also a good idea, unrelated to this, section, is that it's a good idea to have the well tested, right? Have it tested for water quality, right? Your dissolved solids and all that stuff, heavy metals, and then have it tested for rate of flow as well. How much is this well producing? Because if you have a really low producing well, you may have to get like, storage tanks, and basically the way the storage tanks work, if you guys have never been into a home that has these like massive storage tanks, it's kind of like the back of your toilet, right? There's a water tank, and then there's a float in there, and when you flush, right, the float goes down, and then it fills up the tank, and once that float hits that whatever level, it stops filling up, right? And so there's many properties where the well is just a super low capacity well, and so you couldn't shower with this, like the extremely low capacity well, because there's just not enough water output. And so what it does is it runs like pretty much straight, right, until the, like, let's say 1,000-gallon tank, right? They're not all 1,000, but let's say it's 1,000-gallon tank, right? It will fill it up. There's a float in there, and once that float hits a certain level, which will take way longer than it normally would, right, then it will stop pumping water from the well to fill up your tank. And then as you shower, the water will go down, right? And then it will kick that pump back on, and it will start pumping, start pumping water back in until that tank fills up. Okay. Who do you recommend for well testing? So there's just kind of depends on where it's at. We have people all over the state on this call. So just, whoever your local, well testing company is, that's fine. That there are some like home testing kits that you can get to test for water quality. However, that still doesn't test the rate of flow for the well. And so there's companies that specialize in that. Just kind of depends on where you're at. So talk to your whoever your well company is, and good idea to ask around too. I don't deal with a lot of wells. And so Ingram is a well-known well driller. I don't think Ingram actually tests, but you can certainly talk to Ingram, and they can tell you, hey, here's who we use for the testing piece. But yeah, whoever is in your local area. And then Jim says water resources have been helpful in finding a well permit number that on their map showed was across the road. For an upcoming listing that I have, their maps aren't accurate. Yeah, and that's kind of what I was saying, right? Like their website is not always terribly easy to use. And so if you at least have the well permit number, it makes it much easier to go in there and go, okay, yep, this is the permit for this property. But regardless, I would still call them, and they can help you, walk you through it and everything else. Okay. So, yep, they are helpful, but it just makes it easier too if you just have it up front. Okay.
Jesse,
Yep.
have you dealt with any properties that had large springs on them?
I've dealt with some weird stuff. We had one where it was like it had a shared well agreement where the well was actually an irrigation well, and irrigation wells are completely different than your domestic type wells. Like irrigation wells pump thousands of gallons of water, like, on a very regular basis. And so this one had a shared well, but there were some restrictions that were placed on it where it's like, hey, yes, this is your water provider or your water source for the property, but you purchasing this little 2-acre property, you can only use X amount, whereas, the thousands of gallons are going to be used by the farm. So I've dealt with some weird stuff. I don't know that I've specifically dealt with anything where a spring was the water provider for the property. I've dealt with some properties where it had a spring that filled up like some ponds on the property or something, but not as far as I know that was the water provider for the property.
A spring that was used for, it was for watering cattle, for livestock.
Yeah, and in fact, that 114, that 114-acre property I was telling you about, it had 10 shares of North Pooter, but then it also had some running rights regarding ditches, and then it did have a spring that fed a small watering hole. I don't know what you want to call it, but yeah, a small pond for cattle and whatever. So again, that was not the important piece on that one. it was just kind of a bonus for my guy who happens to be a cattle farmer. So he knew that stuff way better than I did. But even though he's been a cattle farmer his whole life, he still had his attorneys look at everything. So
Do you know roughly how much water is a share of water?
it totally depends on the, the ditch company that you're talking
Okay.
about. One might deliver, X amount of acre feet, and one might deliver half of that. So it kind of depends on what you're talking about. And that's why, shares
like-
of,
It's kind of
Yeah,
like
sure.
stocks.
yeah, I mean, well, yeah, one may be based on a, runoff from a particular basin or whatever, and another one may be like way different. So it really just depends. One share of water is not equivalent across the board. Okay. Okay, let's jump back into the contract here. If the buyer is going to receive any water rights to water pursuant to 2.7.2, 2.7.3 or 2.7.4, then the seller is going to agree to convey those water rights by executing the applicable legal instrument. What I will tell you is that most water rights, so like up here in 2.7.1, it asks what type of deed is going to be conveyed for these legally described water rights. In many cases, you're either going to get a bargain and sale deed or a quitclaim deed. You're not going to get warranty deeds, maybe a special warranty deed if you're dealing with someone who doesn't know what they're doing. But really, in most cases, the seller of water wants to make no warranties with respect to the amount or the quality or anything else as far as water goes, because water is so highly litigious in Colorado. It's always undergoing lawsuits, and there's always, these water courts that are just, reallocating water and everything else. You don't want to guarantee anything as far as water rights go. So you're typically going to see either a quitclaim deed or maybe a bargain and sale deed here. Good luck getting anything above and beyond that. Okay. Let's see, we talked about that already. Okay, so any questions on water rights stuff? Andrew said, when is the best time to do a well test? So best time is to do it as part of your inspections for the property, right? So however long it's going to take you to get that well test lined up, make sure that you can do that prior to your inspection objection or inspection termination. So that way, if there's a problem, right, that is part of your inspection. That would not really fall under any other section of our contract. So it needs to be part of your inspection. So give yourself long enough to get that well tested as part of your inspection objection, inspection termination. Okay. All right, so dates and deadlines. So there's a couple people on the call who asked me for a copy of this several weeks ago, and I kind of intentionally avoided you, and you know who you are. And part of the reason I did that is I hate templates. Okay. And so I don't want you to use this as a template, right? Even though I've put in here like some rough days. These are just based on roughly a 30-day closing. The problem is not all of your deals are going to be based on a 30-day closing, right? You might have a cash buyer who wants to close in 14 days. And if that's the case, then having 17 days to terminate based on HOA stuff, it doesn't work, right? And so what I'd rather do is I would rather teach you what these sections are for, right? How those things play into each other, so that you can craft these dates and deadlines for whatever works best for your situation. Okay. And let's see, Jeffrey chatted in a water course that he took that was informative for water rights. So if you guys want to check that out, he popped a link into the chat, so that's cool. But yeah, as far as dates and deadlines go, again, these are just a rough outline of a roughly 30-day closing. And what we'll do is we'll talk about each one of these things as we get to the section that it's referenced in here. What I will say as far as, this particular section, while we're here talking about it, a couple things. One is I never actually use MEC deadlines other than for the alternative earnest money. Okay. And the reason I use it there is because typically we are not turning over the earnest money with the actual contract, right? We're waiting to see if it gets accepted. And so, we're not turning it over with the contract, right? So I use MEC, the MEC format for alternative earnest money deadline. And typically what I'll do is I'll put business days as opposed to just days. And the reason for that is what happens if our offer got accepted on, say, Friday evening at 6 o'clock, and we had MEC plus 2 days, and down below in our contract, right, we said our dates and deadlines would not extend. Well, that means I have to deliver my earnest money by Sunday. And if it's held by a title company, probably impossible. If it's held by a brokerage, maybe possible if they're open on, Saturday or Sunday or whatever, but very difficult. So typically what I'll do is I'll put MEC plus 3 business days here for my alternative earnest money deadline. But otherwise, on all of these, if I'm going to have a deadline in there, I don't actually use MEC plus 7, right? I would look at a calendar and go, okay, today's March 9th. And so this might be March 16th. Okay.
But for a backup, Jesse?
Yep. So good question.
Contract
So,
in first position or?
Yep. So if you have a buyer who wants to put in a backup offer, you don't want to use hard dates here, because you don't know if or when you are ever going to move into first position, right? You don't know if that first offer is going to terminate. And so what I don't want to do, right, is I don't want to, particularly with respect to appraisal or inspections, right? I don't want to put a hard date in there and say, hey, my buyer's going to have their inspection objection be March 16th, okay? Because I may still be in a backup position by March 16th, right? If the first offer hasn't terminated or whatever by March 16th, I don't want my client going to spend $400 on an inspection. Same thing with appraisal, right? I don't want to have my client spend $650 on an appraisal if we're not even in first position, and if the first deal is looking like it's going to close, okay? Well, MEC doesn't really work for backup either, because what does MEC stand for?
Date the contract was
Mutually,
signed?
mutually executed contract.
Yeah, a mutually executed contract, which is the date upon which all the parties have signed the contract, right? Well, MEC plus 7 days, if everybody signs the backup contract, then MEC, if they all sign it today, MEC plus 7 days is still March 16th, right? So we can't use MEC either for backup contracts. And so, there's various different acronyms that people use. CIFP, which stands for contract in first position, right? NFP, notification of first position. You'll see different things, right? But let's just say CIFP, right? CIFP plus 7 days. If you're going to do that, then you have to go down to additional provisions and say, in regards to section 3.1, CIFP shall stand for a contract in first position, which means the date upon which buyer's been notified that their, first position contract has been terminated, and we've moved into primary position, and this contract is in full force and effect, right? So you don't want to use MEC for backup. If you guys are writing a backup offer, just contact me, and I will help you with the verbiage. I'll help you with what you need to do as far as additional provisions, right? Or if you have Damien's clause manual, or if you want Damien's clause manual, just email me, and I'll just chat my email in here. Everybody spells my email wrong, so if it bounces back to you, double check. Everyone spells my last name wrong. There's no I in my first name. Really super thankful to my parents for giving me 2 names that I have to spell to everybody. Pain in the butt. But if you want Damien's clause manual, email me. I'll give that to you. But other stuff as far as these dates and deadlines go, you guys have any questions as far as, again, I don't want to get into a discussion of like, how would you template your dates and deadlines, because no 2 offers are the same, right? So do you guys have general questions about dates and deadlines? Any particular questions that you guys have?
Jesse, I do have a quick question.
Okay.
I'm working, so my first listing is closing next week. And I am dealing with, so like today is my appraisal objection deadline.
Okay.
I still haven't heard back what our appraisal even is.
So you're on the seller side?
Yes.
So, couple things. One is, in many cases, the seller does not actually receive a copy of the appraisal. And sometimes the buyer's agents just don't actually tell you, hey, here's what the property appraised for, which really is not important. I know a lot of sellers are like, oh, what did it appraise for? We want to know. And honestly, in many cases, even if I know, like, you got to be a little bit careful about what you're telling your sellers. You have to keep them fully informed, but telling them what the appraised value was, if it was over list price, is potentially just going to create drama and issues, right? Because then the sellers are like, oh, we didn't get what we wanted for the property. We should terminate and go back on the market and try to get more, right? Which is stupid, because an appraisal is someone's opinion of value, right? You could have 10 appraisers and the other 9 might come in below what your contract price was, right? So you may never find out. And if you find out, you're going to have to consider long and hard whether you actually want to tell your sellers if it was over list price. Now, if it came in at list price, fine. If it comes in under list price, that's when you really have to, I mean, obviously you have to tell them that, right? Because you're going to have to figure something out. But in your case, if the buyer's broker never gets back to you and says, hey, unfortunately, we had a low appraisal and here's what it is, right? I don't care. And honestly, I'm not going to ask. And the reason I'm not going to ask is I don't want to remind them that today's their day. If they blow past today and the appraisal comes back low, then that's not my problem. Now, I will say the exception is if your buyer has an FHA or a VA loan, then those appraisal deadlines do not apply. Okay. And if you look right here, right, a little note here, if FHA or VA loan boxes are checked down in section 4.5.3, then those appraisal deadlines do not apply. Okay. So if you do have an FHA or VA loan, you know, maybe a good idea to start hounding them, even if they wrote a deadline in there, you know, doesn't mean that if they wrote a deadline in there, which was today, and it's FHA or VA, and you get an appraisal back in a week that says it's low, you still have to either, you know, renegotiate the purchase price, or they agree to bring cash, or they have a right to terminate and get their earnest money back, even though they're after those deadlines. But if it's conventional, or if it's cash and they just decided to get an appraisal for whatever reason, right? If it's a conventional loan and today's their day and they miss it, great. They now have no right to terminate the contract based on the appraisal. Okay. The other piece that is important to know here is if they get a low appraisal and that is the reason that their loan does not, you know, that they can't get their loan, they cannot terminate using their new loan termination deadline. And if you don't believe me, go read your contract. It says right here in 5.2, buyer does not have a right to terminate based on the new loan if the objection is based on the appraised value defined below or the lender requirements. Okay. So does it happen from time to time? Yes. People will try to terminate based on the new loan because they got a low appraisal, right? And sometimes, yes, it is hard to prove. You know, if you can't prove that that was the reason why, then you're probably still going to have to give the earnest money back. If it was FHA or VA, it doesn't matter in the first place. But if it was conventional, I'm not even going to ask them today, and I'm never going to ask them probably, right? Because if I don't hear anything, good news. That makes sense?
Yeah, it totally did. Well, and I was, because I've been stressed out knowing like the appraisal resolution deadline is tomorrow and I haven't heard anything back. And so I was thinking, do I reach out? Do I let it go? Because then I want it to keep going, you know, just as is. So I just wasn't sure what I should do.
Yeah. And like the sellers are always super anxious, right? Like, hey, how much did it appraise for? Like, are we good on the appraisal? And if they want you to reach out and ask, then okay, go reach out and ask. But, you know, I think it's also important to advise them, right? Hey, if I go ask them, it might tip them off that, you know, today's their deadline or whatever. Now, if you've already passed your appraisal objection deadline and they didn't, that's today. Okay. Yeah. So, you know, you can wait till tomorrow if you want, and then ask them tomorrow if you didn't hear anything. But again, like typically I'm just hands off, right? If I'm the listing broker, I'm hands off because I don't want to know like, not that I don't want to know, I just don't want to tip them off that, hey, like today's your deadline. If you're not watching your deadlines, that's not my problem, right? So, yeah, do whatever your sellers want, but I would advise them like, hey, if I go ask them today, it may remind them that today's their deadline. Now, the other thing is, if you're a buyer in this market, right, you were probably lucky to get a property under contract in the first place. And so even if I got a low appraisal a week ago, I might hold out until my deadline and then send it over to you at like 10 o'clock tonight, right? Because now I've wasted an extra week of your time, and you hopefully have started to make plans as far as moving and all these other things. And now I've put you in a position where you may not have an option to do anything other than renegotiate the purchase price and come down, right? Or else it's going to cost you, time to go back on the market and get it back under contract, play the appraisal game again, right? So I might intentionally waste as much of your time as I can, hoping that now you've started to make moving plans and you've put another property under contract. So don't be surprised if that happens too, but I wouldn't ask.
Okay, so tomorrow comes and goes. I don't hear anything back from them. I mean, we're on track to close on the 19th as everything is stated in the contract, correct? Like I don't have anything to worry about.
Well, so first of all, is it FHA or VA?
I'm pretty sure it's conventional.
Okay, so if it's conventional and you don't hear back today, tomorrow's deadline means nothing. If there was no objection, resolution means nothing,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So if you don't hear back today, effectively, they have lost their right to terminate based on the appraisal. Now, does that mean that you're on track to close on the 19th or not? I don't really know. I mean, they could still face delays, right? But regardless, they have no right to terminate
Okay.
based on their appraisal. Now, they may have, other rights to terminate in your contract, but assuming that's all we're talking about, they have no right to terminate based on the, a low appraisal in a conventional situation. Okay.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Yep, you bet. Other questions on, hold on, I'm getting.
What happens when we have an appraisal that comes in $1,000 under?
You tell me, Gary. What
remember
happened?
that? It's just like, you gotta be kidding me. Come on, man. Thank goodness the seller was like, we'll just adjust the price. Fine.
Yeah. So, it's a good question, right? Of what do you do when you have a low appraisal? Well, it depends on if I have the buyer or the seller, right? If I have the seller, then I might want to try to do a rebuttal to the appraisal. Now, know that if you do that, you're probably just spinning your wheels, because appraisers aren't wrong. And if you ask them, they'll tell you such, right? They just think that highly of themselves, that they don't make mistakes ever, right? And so they're probably not going to adjust the value of the appraisal. You might have a case if you just have a really terrible appraisal, but what I'll tell you is, I see so many times where agents are like, this terrible appraiser, look at this, it came in $25,000 low. And then I go and I pull the comps and I'm looking at it and I'm like, you're lucky you got what you got, right? But they're mad because it's low. And so be careful, right? Not all appraisers are terrible just because they come in low. Go prove that there's better comps out there, or they missed an adjustment, or that their adjustment values that they're making are not typical for the, the market or whatever. But just saying you did a terrible appraisal because you came in $20,000 below, they're never going to adjust based on that, right? And the other thing they're not going to do is they're not going to say, hey, yeah, the greatest house in the neighborhood sold for more, but that's not a comp to your property. Your property is 1,000 square feet smaller. It's dated. That one was updated, right? Like if it's not comparable, I don't care what another home in the neighborhood sold for. It's still not comparable, right? So what do you do? It kind of depends on who you have. If I have the buyer, then my answer is I try to get it down to the appraised value, right? Now, of course, if your contract has an appraisal gap clause, which most of them do right now, then yeah, like your buyer's going to have to pay at least whatever your purchase, your appraised value plus your appraisal gap was. Okay. But what if the appraisal is much shorter than your appraisal gap clause? Well, then what? I mean, try to negotiate it down to your appraisal gap. right? That's the best that you can do, you know, and try to, you know, if you have the buyer, then maybe try to affirm the stuff that's in the appraisal. Hey, listing broker, you know, I reviewed the appraiser's work. You know, it looks like he pulled good comps as far as I can tell. I don't see any better comps. His adjustments all look good to me. I just don't think you're going to get a better appraisal from another appraiser. Am I missing something? Do you see any better comps out there that I've missed? Right? And put it back on them. And if they want to go to bat and try to fight the appraiser, great. But I'm not going to go fight the appraiser and, you know, do a detriment to my client. Just doesn't make sense. So it kind of depends on who you have. But at the end of the day, it's a renegotiation. Okay. Other questions on dates and deadlines, and we'll cover more of this stuff as we get to the sections. But you guys have any other questions as far as dates and deadline stuff? Possession date and time real quick. I'll go over. Typically what I put is delivery of deed for both. I don't like to put, you know, if your closing date was going to be April, April 9th, right? I don't like to put a possession date of April 9th as well. And the reason why is because let's say your deal is just going along super smooth, right? And you're going to close it instead of on April 9th, you're going to close it on April 6th, right? And so you do an amendment, you're going to amend the closing date. You know what people always forget to do? They forget to amend that possession date as well, right? And so if you don't amend the possession date, technically you have a contract that says the possession date is April 9th, the closing date is April 6th, okay? Because now you've done an amendment that says the closing date's April 6th. So does that mean that your buyer doesn't have the right to occupy the property for the first 3 days, right? It's almost like a free 3-day post-closing occupancy for the seller. Well, was that the intention of your client or was it not? It probably wasn't. So, you know, I typically just put delivery of deed, and then that's automatically going to adjust if the closing date gets adjusted as well. Okay. Possession time, same thing. Delivery of deed. I don't care whether we close at 9 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right? Whenever we close and the deed gets delivered, that's when possession is going to take place. Okay. Now, there is something to be said about delivery of deed and funding, which some people will put in there, right? Funding is not really defined in our contract. We have some stuff that's close that we'll talk about, but I did have a deal that just closed on Friday and it closed Friday at 4 o'clock. Well, when do you think the sellers got their proceeds for the sale of the property? If we closed at 4 and their funds were going to be wired, they missed the wire cutoff deadline, right? They didn't get their funds until Monday. Now, that being said, you know, in our case, sellers were like, yeah, we don't care. That's fine. We'll get our money on Monday. You can take possession on Friday at 4, whatever, right? Once the closing has happened and the wire transfer has gone through, you know, buyer probably has no right to terminate just because the funds haven't hit the seller's bank account, right? The sale is still complete. So pick and choose whatever you want. Some people will put delivery of deed and funding in there. You may need to define funding because it's not well defined. We'll talk about it a little bit, but it's really not well defined. So you may have to define that. Okay. Acceptance deadline date.
Jesse,
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you back up just for a second? Could you go over, because I see this all the time. Could you go over 26, 27, and 28, which is your inspection objection deadline? Did you do that and I missed it?
No, I was going to talk about it when we get
No,
there.
I saw the dates, but okay.
Yeah, I was going to talk about it, those sections, but we can talk about it now.
No,
So
do it whenever.
no, that's okay. This is fine. So with regards to inspection, objection, and termination, right? If you read the text, you know, down in section 10.3, what it says is that your inspection termination cannot be later than your inspection resolution deadline. And so what a lot of brokers will do is instead of lining up your inspection objection and your inspection termination, what they'll do is they'll line up the termination and the resolution. And I'm not crazy about doing it that way. And here's why. So let's say we have, you know, again, forget about MEC. Let's say it was a hard date, right? But just conceptually, if we have 10 days out for our inspection objection, and then we have 14 days out for our termination and 14 days for our resolution, effectively what you could argue is that the buyer would have a right to object. So buyer says, hey, seller, here's the list of things that we object to. And they do that on day 10, right? And then day 12 rolls around. We haven't put a resolution together. We're still waiting to hear back from the seller. And all of a sudden now the buyer says, hey, you know what? I changed my mind. I'm just going to terminate today. It's just a weird sequence, right? To have a termination that's different than your objection deadline. I like to line it up, right? Because after the inspection, after the inspection happens, your client either needs to say, either it was so bad I'm done, right, and terminate, or I'm okay moving forward as long as these things get repaired, okay? And so they need to decide, are we going to terminate or are we going to object to something, right? And even if as long as you object to something, it doesn't matter that your termination is now passed, right? Because if you don't get a resolution by the resolution deadline, it's going to terminate anyway. So it's not like you lose the right to terminate, right? If the seller just refuses to do anything, it's automatically going to terminate as long as you objected on or before your inspection objection. So there's no reason, in my opinion, to have this be anything other than the same day as your inspection objection. Okay.
Gotcha.
Now, the other thing that I will say as far as inspection stuff goes is that we never used to have an inspection termination deadline. It used to only be an inspection objection and an inspection resolution deadline. The reason they added this is because brokers, and you'll see it a lot, brokers will go down into additional provisions and they'll say, oh, buyer's agreeing to purchase the property in as is condition. And the purpose of the inspection is to, have a list of repairs that the buyer's going to correct after closing, or, we won't object to anything other than health or safety issues, right? They write all of this bogus crap into additional provisions. And the problem is, if there's a deadline in here, that means that this section applies, right? That means that my inspection objection applies. And if my inspection objection applies, do you know what that says? What it says is I effectively have a right to object or terminate in my sole subjective discretion, right, to any of these things. It doesn't have to be health and safety. It doesn't have to be buyers purchasing the property as is, yada, yada, whatever, right? Because 10.2 already says buyers purchasing the property in as is condition, where is and with all faults. And what I'll tell you is as is doesn't even mean what you think it means. As is has a legal meaning that we'll actually watch a short video when we get down to section 10.2, right? And so all of that extra crap that gets put into additional provisions, you just have to be careful, because if you advise your buyer, or advise your seller, let's say you're working with a seller, oh, hey, the buyer said they were going to purchase the property as is, right? But they have an inspection objection deadline. They have an inspection termination. They have an inspection resolution deadline. They could throw the kitchen sink at you, and it doesn't matter whether it's health or safety or structural or anything else, right? They have a right to do that per section 10.3. So what the Real Estate Commission did was they said, okay, let's add this inspection termination deadline. So we add an inspection termination deadline. And the reason for that is now what you can effectively do is you can say buyer is going to waive their inspection objection. And if they waive their objection, they don't need a resolution deadline, but they're going to reserve the right to terminate if it's bad enough, right? So effectively, you're saying buyer is waiving their right to object to anything on the inspection. Doesn't matter whether it's health, safety, structural, anything else. The buyer is waiving their right to ask for anything. Their only right is going to be to terminate. And if their only right is to terminate, we don't need an inspection resolution.
Gotcha.
Okay. So you can put NA for your inspection objection. you put NA for your resolution, and then pick a date for whatever your inspection termination deadline is going to be. That being said, right, if it gets down to it, right, buyer does their inspection and they say, hey, Harry, you know, we had our inspection. We're really sorry. We don't have a right to ask for anything, but it's bad, right? And so we're just going to have to terminate. And so here's our inspection termination. Or if the sellers are interested in continuing to move forward, right, we can all mutually agree to some repairs, which maybe they might want to do, because if the furnace is out, right, that's going to be a problem for the next buyer too. So why not just fix it for me, and we'll keep this deal moving forward. So just because a buyer waives their inspection objection and waives their resolution doesn't necessarily mean that the parties can't maybe put something together. It doesn't mean that there may not be some renegotiation at that point anyway. But hopefully, if nothing else, it signals to you that, hey, the buyer is not going to nitpick you on all the little stupid stuff that's going to cost, $5, at Home Depot to go get an extension for the downspout, right? Like, is that important? Yes. Could it create structural issues if they don't put, the extension piece on the downspout? Yeah, sure, it could create issues. That being said, it's a $5 fix, right? Like, go after the important pieces. Okay.
So if it was a furnished and they were going to get it fixed, then you just do an amend, extend, and then state in there that it'd be fixed by a certain date.
Yeah. So if you had waived your inspection objection and resolution, right, and then, I mean,
agreed.
Probably you're not going to terminate based on a downspout extension, but let's say that the furnace was out, right? And the seller said, hey, no, we don't want you to terminate. Like, that we'll at least take care of major problems, right? Then yeah, just do an amend extend. It's not an inspection resolution because there was no objection. You're going to do an amend extend that says, seller agrees to have the furnace, certified,
Gotcha.
make any recommended repairs on or before this deadline, right?
Okay. Yep.
And that's how you would address it. Yep.
Cool.
I guess while we're talking about it here, and since we don't have a ton of time left, what I will say is, don't in a competitive market where there are competitive offers, it doesn't make sense to add contingencies for things that your client isn't going to, object or terminate under anyway. And so, particularly if you have the lot and block type legal description, right? If your buyer is not going to go get a survey, which the overwhelming majority of buyers, maybe up in like Estes Park, right, where you have some acreage properties, or, down in Elizabeth, right, where you got acreage property, maybe ILCs or surveys are more prevalent. But if we're talking about a home in a subdivision, in a lot and block type subdivision, where your client says, hey, I really don't care if the fence is 6 inches over the line or not. If it's on my side, then I'm not going to fuss about it. If it's on the other side and the neighbor fusses about it, right, I'll just move the fence. I'm not going to spend $600 on an ILC, right, or whatever the cost is going to be. I would never spend the money on an ILC or a survey. If that's if that's your client's mindset, then there's no reason to put deadlines in here in a competitive situation where you're competing against other offers, right? Make your offer look as strong as possible if that's the goal, right? And just NA or leave it blank or delete it or whatever, right? If your client wouldn't do it, then don't put anything here. Same thing with due diligence documents, right? Like, if the only thing that you're asking for in due diligence documents is any warranties or manuals for the kitchen appliances, well, would your client ever actually terminate because they don't like the language found in the owner's manual for the fridge? If the answer is no, then don't put a deadline in there. Now, you may have some other legitimate due diligence documents that might relate to your particular deal, but if that's what you're asking for, my advice would be why put it in there? Is your buyer ever actually going to object based on the owner's manuals or the warranty on the appliances? And I've never come across a buyer that would. I'm not saying they're not out there, but if you don't need it, you don't need it. Make your offer look more attractive and just get rid of it if your client would never do it. Okay.
Jesse, real quick, you jumped up to inspections, but I had just a comment on the possession date.
Okay,
Oh, yeah, the closing and possession, when you're dealing with a manufactured home, whether you're the seller's agent or the buyer's agent, some places do not fund right away. I know we're at table funding, but they don't fund right away if there's a loan because they want to do their own due diligence and check to make sure there's not any liens or anything on that manufactured homes. And sometimes it takes 3 to 4 days to get that funding. So you have to have that
Yeah.
discussion about what's going to happen in the meantime with your buyer, if they can move in, or the seller. And
yeah, and yeah, the other important part is that if you're doing a manufactured home, right,
it's different.
it's not deeded. There's a certificate of title. So,
Exactly.
you know, you put delivery of certificate of title and funding, right?
Mhm.
So that may be different.
Right.
One other quick thing I will mention, just because we're in a crazy competitive market. So I have clients who are, you know, they are getting a loan, a conventional loan, and it is contingent. I mean, my clients cannot purchase the home without getting a loan. They don't have cash, right? However, in order to be competitive, they actually waived their new loan termination deadline. They put NA in here, right? Because it doesn't mean that they're not getting a loan. It just means they have no right to terminate based on the loan. Now, that's okay to do, but you still have to disclose, hey, my clients are still getting a loan, right? And they can't purchase the property paying cash. All they're saying by putting NA here is I have no right to terminate based on the loan.
Okay, so Jesse, so
Yeah.
loan company calls and says, sorry, Jesse, you just don't have the money to get this loan.
You're screwed.
You're then gonna have to figure out something else in the contract to get out of it. if you
Well,
can't.
if that's the reason you're terminating, then it doesn't matter what other contingencies you have in the contract. You can't use a contingency for something other than what it's supposed to be used for. Now, you know, if you're past all of your other dates and deadlines anyway, it doesn't matter, you're screwed. If you have some other deadlines that are still hanging out there,
Okay, all right.
let's say inspections, right? Maybe you do your inspection and maybe there is something that's objectionable in there, right? And
Yeah.
then maybe you have a right to terminate based on that. However, if you're using your inspection termination as a way to get out because your lender called and said, hey, sorry, but we can't fund the deal for you, like that's in bad faith, you're going to lose your earnest money.
Okay,
Okay. All right. We talked about deadlines for way too long. Now we're out of time. So we'll pick it up next week at section 3.2. We'll go through, I don't know, probably only 3 more sections next week. But if you guys have questions in the meantime, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks for your time.
You bet. We'll see you guys.